Welcome to Muslims and Mental Health with Sister Heather, a groundbreaking program looking at mental health issues through the biopsychosocial spiritual paradigm.
Welcome to another episode of Muslims and Mental Health. Today we begin our first episode in the month of African American History Month, and I'm joined by Jarvis Sams, and we are going to be discussing mental health in the African American community. I want to start by first alerting you to some important facts about African American mental health. According to the United States Health and Human Services Office of Minority Health, adult blacks are 20% more likely to report serious psychological distress than adult whites. Adult blacks living below poverty are 2 to 3 times more likely to report serious psychological distress than those living above poverty. Adult blacks are more likely to have feelings of sadness, hopelessness, and worthlessness than are adult whites. And while blacks are less likely than whites to die from suicide as teenagers, black teenagers are more likely to attempt suicide than are white teenagers, 8.2% versus 6.3%. African Americans of all ages are more likely to be victims of serious violent crime than are non-Hispanic whites, making them more likely to meet diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. So I would like you to join me in welcoming Jarvis Sams to our program. He is a professor at the Pacific Oaks College in Pasadena, and he is a marriage and family therapist. His primary population of clients include African Americans, Latinos, and other underserved populations. So join me in welcoming him. Welcome, Jarvis.
Hey, thank you, Heather. Thank you.
It's such a pleasure to have you today
Pleasure
with
to
us.
be here, definitely.
And I want to start out by asking you, what is the current status of mental health care in the African American community?
The current status, that's pretty varied. So I'm going to try to narrow it and make sure we have a really good conversation about that today. I would say it has to be traced back to a lot of the post-traumatic issues that are happening in the community and has happened via slavery, Jim Crow, and the like. So that's why I say it's very varied. And you have to look at that in that context, that mental health, the stigma that is associated with it in the African American community, and I love the fact that you shared those statistics. Those statistics are true, and they ring true, but then the next question is, how many of them are seeking out help?
Right.
And perhaps they're not seeking out help because of the stigma, because of the trauma that has come along with slavery, Jim Crow, and segregation, and racism. Those things we have to keep in context. So I would say right now mental health is probably at an all-time low, probably even lower in the sense that people seeking out mental health that is not court-ordered. If it's court-ordered, whether the DCFS, the Department of Children and Family Services, or because of divorce court, custody court, things of that nature, those people are probably having to go and get family services and look and seek out someone like myself or yourself to get assistance because they're mandated to go and do it. So I wonder how many people are seeking out, and the statistics I came across were very small, about 4 to 5%. African Americans are actually going out and seeking out therapeutic help on their own. But I think that number is going to change. So hopefully we'll talk about that a little bit more as we move on.
So I'm glad you brought up the idea of stigma, because one of the questions I wanted to ask you is it accessible, and is it readily available? And as we know, there are many types of stigma. There's self-stigma, there's label avoidance, There's public stigma, there is structural stigma.
Yes.
And the structural stigma, a lot of people may not be aware of what structural stigma is, but that is when a society specifically creates an environment which makes it difficult to have access to things like mental health care.
Yes.
Where maybe there's not public transportation, or there's not a clinic, or there's where people can have access to it. So do you feel like that's a factor in the stigma in the African American community getting mental health care, or?
I definitely do. And here's where I will go with that. I love the fact that you use structural stigma. I'm going to say more for African Americans, it's more like an infrastructure stigma. And we're going to go back to looking at slavery. And then I'm going to use one particular moment in time. You're familiar with the Tuskegee experiment, right?
Absolutely.
And for your viewers who may not be familiar with the Tuskegee experiment, that's an experiment that was government run, where they actually injected African American males in Tuskegee, Alabama, with syphilis, and did not let them know. They wanted to run an experiment and see how long these people would live with syphilis, and then what would happen, what would the outcomes be. And that instance built up a stigma for African Americans at that point, because it's like, wait a minute, these are people who are supposed to be taking care of me, right, and responsible for me and helping me go in and want to see a doctor, but now the doctor is the one who's injecting me with syphilis, and something that could kill me. And then we fast forward to currently what's happening in Flint, Michigan.
Right.
And a predominantly African American community, again relying on the government source, and they're being fed lead water that's full of lead,
right,
lead particles that are like I think it's 275%.
Taking showers with everything,
right? So Legionnaire's disease, all these things could come about it. So now again, we put our trust in it. So when someone like yourself or myself walks in and say, hey, we represent the government to them. We represent the establishment, even though we are not a part of the establishment, and we're trying to provide therapeutic services. We're the infrastructure. We're a part of. They feel like we're a part of the infrastructure. Therefore, the stigma that's associated with the infrastructure is like, no, I don't want to do that, because look what they did to me here, and they consistently over and over continue to do over and over again in our community. So I think that's why the number is so low as African Americans going in and trying to seek out help and assistance. I think as a professor at Pacifica Oaks College, I think one of the things that I'm doing is like changing the face and the structure of what it looks like to actually come in and see a therapist, what a therapist looks like. I'm not your traditional looking therapist. I don't look like Freud. I don't represent like Boyne. I'm a different kind of person. And I think that is what's going to change the structure, because I look more like the person that's coming through the door, and they see me and they want to stay, and they want to get through that initial hump of I'm afraid to be here, because they feel like there's someone that they can actually attach to in a positive way, and that isn't going to hurt them. That's actually in it for the right reasons. So percentages are low, with going back to your question, but infrastructure is really.
And so what do you think about the self-stigma? Is that a factor or no?
I think that is more of a self-stigma in African American community, because it's a community, like it's or family.
So you see it more collective.
It's collective.
As opposed to individualistic.
And I'll give you an example. And I do this in class. I think you may have even heard me say this in class before, maybe not, but we all have that one cousin in the African American family, and maybe even Latino, and maybe even Asian American families, and even maybe in white families, that we lock in the room, and don't go there because cousin Ray Ray is kind of weird, right? Something wrong with cousin Ray Ray, right? But no one's doing any work, because the family is protecting Ray Ray, because they're afraid, one, because of the Tuskegee experiment in the Flint, Michigan. It's like, if we send him to get help, will he be okay?
Well, those were already on top of a whole history of oppression and so many other things.
Exactly. Right? So when you look at the history of the oppression and the racism, and then you look at these other things, and now here it is. We can, stigma, stick him in a room, we'll take care of him, and we don't want him to get out in the world. But now he's not getting the help for his mental illness. So we're talking about mental health, and people get mental health and mental illness confused. So mental health is actually trying to help someone be, treat their issues like depression, maybe even bipolar. Mental illness like a psychotic issue, or maybe even something as simple as autism or Down syndrome, where the misconceptions, the labels that there's something wrong with this individual, there's nothing to help that person change the cognitions, because they've stuck them in the room because of the stigma that's going to come on the family, because we have Uncle Ray Ray and he's not quote unquote normal. Well, what is normal? Is the question I would ask. So it's being able to have these conversations like this, and that's why I'm glad that you brought me here. Because what we do is we're going to be able to tear down some walls, hopefully.
And so you kind of answered this already, but I just want to ask you again to see if there's anything else you want to add to
Sure.
it. And why is it that mental health is important to the African American community?
Oh, certainly. The conversation, it's a conversation about it. There's clearly some type of traumatic instances that are happening not only here in America, but throughout the African diaspora. The trauma that's associated with slavery or colonization is what we have to consider. And if you don't address it, then of course you have some of the things that you're having. And then what's happening is then what we quote unquote, there's a book out there, a little plug for Dr. Alexander, The New Jim Crow is the name of the book, and it talks about basically a re-enslavement of African Americans using the prison industrial complex. And you and I both know what they do is they tend to, if you have something, a mental disorder, or what they categorize as a mental disorder, they stick you in jail and you don't get any assistance and you're just put back on the street. So the concept of the need and what's wise necessity is because what we have to do is we have to address those issues. So perhaps these people are getting the assistance, whether they're in jail or they're in their schools, and we can actually overcome it versus sticking them in a closet at home, in your family home, or either sticking them in a closet in what's called the jail. Is that? I hope that answers a little bit.
No, yeah, I'm just thinking because even in the prison system, they're dehumanized even further.
Right.
Probably its conditioning becomes worse because not only are they stuck in what is like a cage, they are also put into different colored jumpsuits.
Right. Exactly.
Many microaggressions occur
over and
that,
over again.
Just further dehumanize them.
And something that you and I are familiar with, the gatekeeper, right? For the viewers, again, the gatekeeper is someone who's stopping you from getting to where you're trying to go education-wise. It's jumping through these hurdles. A few of us can seep through the cracks, right? But the masses are feeling like they're being shut out. So when you feel like you're getting shut out, ideally inside of you I would say just somewhere inside of you, deep inside of you, you feel, oh wow, I'm blocked out of this particular segment of opportunity for myself. And thus, to piggyback on something I said earlier, that's why there's a need for, people of color, minorities, in some way, shape, or fashion in our industry, in our field, in therapy and psychology, because we are going to be able to knock down the barriers and then actually deal with those doors. The concept that always that comes up in my mind is when I worked at a group home, which will go unnamed, but I worked at a group home for a while, and there were African American and Latino kids that were going through this group home, and they were dealing with substance abuse issues. And one of these children got misdiagnosed completely wrong, because I'm of the opinion that the DSM, although it's a great diagnostic tool, it does not necessarily speak to African American and Latino diagnoses. It speaks to predominantly white diagnoses for people in Iowa. And so it doesn't take into context all of this other stuff. So this kid is being diagnosed with bipolar and left and right and given the wrong medication. And we've already started in the wrong place. And now you're starting the stigma because you're not doing the work for that person. And luckily I came in and was able to work with this particular client and understand that she was not bipolar and that she was actually ADHD. Let's get her on the right medicine. We got her on the right medicine. And lo and behold, now she's has a fruitful life, and she's no longer using any illegal drugs, and she's on a basic Ritalin / Adderall.
So it seems like the addictions probably were having to do, or the substance use was having to do with coping skills.
Trying to actually self-medicate.
Okay. So I want to circle back actually to talk a little bit more about the post-traumatic stress.
Okay.
But at this point, I need to take a short break for our sponsors.
Definitely.
So we'll come back to that in just a minute.
Hi. Welcome to Adelante. This is Adelante Recovery, and my name is Yvette Kuglin, and I'm part of the staff.
Adelante Recovery Center has helped people in dual diagnosis for 5 years. We accept most PPO insurances and provide luxury accommodations and 24-hour support. To speak with an admissions counselor, call 1-888-242-4450.
A lot of time we don't even know what's wrong with us, and sometimes we need to get away to figure that out. So if you want to go for a little retreat out in Corona Del Mar, which is a confidential location, we're here to help. So we're only a phone call away. Thank you.
Welcome back to Muslims and Mental Health. Today we are discussing mental health in the African American community with Jarvis Sams. We're going to continue on now. I want to talk to you a little bit more about post-traumatic stress and to let our viewers know that we also have something called post-traumatic stress slave syndrome.
Slave syndrome. So it's post-traumatic slave syndrome.
Slave syndrome, sorry. And so I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so there's an author by the name of Dr. Joy DeGruy who came up with this and coined this title, or she's been credited with coining the title post-traumatic slave syndrome. And simply what it is, and it's not just something that is left to African Americans. It's actually a byproduct of anyone who is a part of the American system. Is her theoretical framework is that because of slavery, the systems around us has been shaped in a way that provides a post-traumatic stress disorder, which she actually calls it post-traumatic slave syndrome, that is actually going to just, sits on top of someone. So back in the previous segment, I spoke about how we had the Tuskegee experiment and also what's currently going on in Flint, Michigan. Well, according to Dr. DeGruy, these are just byproducts of slavery. And this is just a post-traumatic slave syndrome that makes these things even capable of happening, making Jim Crow capable of happening, making segregation capable of happening because of the post-traumatic slave syndrome that not only African Americans are dealing with, but white Americans are dealing with, and then other cultures are dealing with, because when they come here, they're seeing this is what they're being told and filtered in a certain light what they should expect about African Americans. Thus, you have the trauma that actually sits on top of African Americans from birth, even though they weren't born into slavery. And there's been some work behind it. And the word starts with a G, and I cannot remember the word right now. But there's been some work around this where it's been proven that this, trauma can be passed from generation to generation to generation to generation. And the word slips me, but they did it when it was reflective upon people who went most recently through the Holocaust. And there's
It's genetic.
What?
It's a genetic type
It's like
of
a genetic, right. So.
Because the trauma literature suggests that people can be born from trauma.
Exactly.
They're born into it,
so
traumatized.
So in theory, Dr. DeGruy's theory about post-traumatic slave syndrome is that the genetics is just passing down. In 400 years of slavery, you have to imagine it's going to take about 400 or 500 years of non-slavery to get rid of it. But we had 400 years of slavery and then another 50 years of segregation. So we're looking at about 500 years. Well, you need almost 500 years to, in a way, peel back those onion layers to get to where that trauma is. And it's about a lot of work. I actually mentioned this on one of my social media sites yesterday. It's like, it's time to have the really hard discussions about racism in this country. But in this trauma that is actually permeating all of us. You get African Americans, they don't even realize that the trauma is still there, and they're going to project it onto each other through colorism.
Right.
And and then you have your white folks who are like, well, my family didn't own slaves, or that was so many years ago, I don't think that way. Yeah, but you benefit from it through something called white privilege. Like,
right.
So you have to be able to consider those things. So those things and these microaggressions and that permeate, it's just a byproduct. And post-traumatic slave syndrome it's a huge umbrella, but I don't look at it as an umbrella like this. You flip it over and it's a catch-all for all the trauma. So you flip the umbrella upside down and it all filters into the umbrella.
Right.
So now it's like scooping all the water out the umbrella and trying to figure out how to actually do the work. So
It makes me think of, the Pew Research did a study not so long ago talking about how few Americans know a Muslim. And even though African Americans have been a part of our history forever, there are segments of our country where people can say, I've never met an African American.
They've only seen them on TV.
Yeah,
if
I've only
that.
seen them on TV or, right. And so it just makes me think that there's a lot of work to be done just in people knowing each other. Because as we talk about white, hegemonic culture and what produces post-traumatic slave syndrome, it just doesn't happen in the African American community, although it takes on a particular flavor.
In that community,
We've seen
right.
the Native Americans experience with the smallpox,
Exactly.
Blankets on the Trail of Tears,
Yes,
and
right.
being, so there are other minority groups that have had similar atrocities committed against them.
And work isn't being done in those
different.
communities. But the work isn't being done in the communities, right? And
Right.
the work not being done in the communities, this is back to Dr. DeGroo's, her thing is, these are all byproducts of just historical nature of this country that we live in, and being able to do the work as therapists and people who are really getting out there and trying to do this work, we have to actually beat down the walls and say, hey, look, this is what it is. Like, meet them where they are.
Right.
Right? And the reality of it is, okay, I'm not saying that every African American is sitting there and like, oh, woe is me. That's not what's happening. But some of them don't even know that there are so many that they're doing disservices to their own self. And they're inflicting self-pain or because they're not willing to do the work. And it's finding people who are willing to go into those communities and have those tough discussions. Not just with African Americans, with white Americans, Native Americans, Latino Americans. These are tough discussions.
Well, this leads me into my next question, which is, what has your experience been dealing with all the key stakeholders and raising awareness in this issue? But before you answer that, I want to just add that I understand what you're talking about, because even when we look at our field, there are not enough African Americans at the table. And because when we look at like things like the licensing exam, and you get questions on there such as, what do African American women expect when they come in for treatment? And the answer is that you must give them practical solutions or they won't return to therapy. And it puts African Americans in such a box that's so ridiculous.
Yeah, as I
from
prepare
my
for this,
perspective.
as I prepare for
And-
this, that's what I thought. I was like, you can't generalize African Americans like that. You can't, you can't
But
base
what it indicated to me is like, African Americans are not at the table
to be able to have the discussion.
to frame the discussion.
Yeah,
Because you're putting them in a box that represents maybe some people,
a few,
but
not all.
are you telling me that every African American woman wants practical solutions and they aren't open to other types of, like the only therapy they're open to is brief short-term therapy? No, some women are going to be open to other things.
I think that that's something as I prepare for this, I was thinking about like, wow, the issue that you have is that, and I'm going to connect the key stakeholders to this. The issue is, one, we are not at the table to be able to have these discussions. Our diversity book is the same diversity book across platforms. I won't say their names, but everybody.
I have many times.
So you have, okay, it says, so Sue and Sue they're the people that we turn to in this field to say, make determination what is a diversity issue or how you handle it. And unfortunately, you've boxed me into a category, and that's not who I am. I think what happens is, the brief therapeutic model in the beginning may be a key entryway to helping people, and because this is new to them, therapy may be new to them, and that's not only for African Americans. I think that's for clients in general,
Right.
because it's new to them. But once they get used to it, then you can introduce other models that that they can actually take hold of. But it's one is building the therapeutic alliance with these individuals, so that they have the rapport with you, that they feel comfortable with you, so that you can do the exploration. And you and I both know that takes about 7 to 8, maybe 10 weeks to really do the work, to feel that relationship, that alliance with the client, in order to do these necessary tools. So as key stakeholders, it allows as I looked at the question when you said that to me earlier and you wrote them out to me, we aren't at the table. And the key stakeholders don't look anything like me. And they're the ones who are making decisions for people like me. And I think the way that we change that is, one, we have to knock down the doors. I love the fact that you're doing this show. And when you asked, I was like, yeah, let me go. I'm going to find a way. If I don't have the time, I'm going to find an hour or two out of my time to come and do this. It's the way to change the idea. My thing is this 30 minutes or 40 minutes or whatever it is, being able to pass this on to people who may hear it. It could change. If it changes one person, then it changes their philosophy. So I look at myself as a key stakeholder, but it's also being able to actually go in and have these hard discussions with APA, CAMP, AMP, the Association, American Psychological Association, the California Association of Marriage and Family Therapy, and the American Association of Marriage and Family Therapy, and say, look, we have a diversity issue, and this book does not do the work.
Right.
And then
even along the lines of Muslims, right? So there are 4 pages in the Su and Su book about Muslims, and it's Arabs and Muslims. So you lump a whole diaspora into 4 pages, and about which in the American population, the African Americans are actually the largest group of Muslim Americans. So how does a chapter on Arab and Muslims start to talk about that?
There's no cultural consideration. It isn't any at all. It's actually very narrow, and unfortunately, we have 7 billion people on this planet. With 7 billion people on this planet, if you try to put us into a narrow gap, any of it is. I
mean, I do appreciate that they have made an attempt. To be comprehensive.
Definitely.
But it's just not there yet. It's still
impossible.
needs more work.
It's impossible for them to do it, and I think it's Muslim Americans, African Americans, Latino Americans getting out and writing their own books. People of color writing their own books and actually focusing and say, hey, here's some information. That's part of what my dissertation is. It's writing something that's going to be geared towards African American and Latino American couples, so that we have something that we can actually draw upon and say, this is a modality that works to help these couples.
And we actually are this month, in honor of African American history, going to be covering 2 books that are significant, which are Islam and the Black American, and Islam and Black Suffering.
Oh, love it. Love it. So I would love to read that along with you all, see what's going on.
But moving on, what are the barriers to getting treatment in the African American community that you can identify?
Well, one barrier that I would identify is lack of resources. And what I mean by that, and the resource is the actual therapy. My own thing, and I know looks like time is coming short, but my own experience was I did not want to go to therapy unless it was an African American male therapist. Now my ex-wife found one, and hence I'm here. I become a therapist because I realized that there were not many men in the field, and there weren't many African Americans. So I know that there are a lot of African Americans. One, they go to their pastor, their imam, their rabbi, and that's where they rely on. They rely on God, religion for their therapeutic model. But I think the resource of having a therapist that looks like them and that they can readily identify with would be a big. We would see a flood of people getting assistance and seeking out assistance. So that's one thing.
I think it's, just to use an analogy that I like to use sometimes, because it's perfectly natural for people to want to go to their faith representatives.
Yeah,
and for a lot of things, that's all you need. But if I could just use the example of a cup, right?
Got it.
So if we think of the cup and these are our normal levels of stress, and this is, what's put into us every day. And then at some point, the stresses overflow. And that overflow is what's not typically normal.
Right.
And that's where we come in. We come in to be an additive to help with that overflow, to get them back in the cup, so that they can function, in a healthy, functional way.
I think that's the thing that we have to continue to have the conversation about is...
It's not that we're coming to change everything in the cup.
No. Actually, we want to enhance what's in the cup.
Right.
The goal is not to change your spirituality or your faith. It's to actually enhance it and make you go deeper and do the work that is necessary so that you can actually get where you're trying to go. Faith without work is like, might as well not have faith. Right. So it's like, you can pray all day long, but if you're not doing some work, you're not going to get the answers that you want. So that's my opinion.
And so along those lines, what are some of the common misconceptions that clinicians have when treating African Americans?
The one that pops off the top of my head is they generalize us, they generalize the, stereotypes, not understanding the difference between, and I'm going to use some colloquialisms right now, between being ratchet or ghetto, and being from the ghetto, and still prescribing to them. And, we see it. And I'll use athletes as a perfect example. The expectation for African American athletes is that when they get there, they'll be humble. All right, they get to the pros, or they get to achieving whatever they're achieving, they'll be humble, but they want to just celebrate, and it may be something as simple as a simple celebration, like one's the dab right now, right? But then you look at someone, if he was a white athlete doing a dance, the discount double check is no big deal. It's these stereotypes that African Americans, when you get here, you should be in a one box, and not understanding that you still may be varied, and you may have so much more going on with you. I'm so layered. You know me well, so you know how layered I am. I can have a conversation like this, and then I can have a conversation in a totally different environment. Right. But it doesn't change my intelligence. It doesn't change my ability to blend in and blend out when necessary. So don't look at the client as one box that you may have read in your book, in that chapter that you read. One-dimensional diversity issue. There's this diaspora, whether it's Muslim or African American or even Latin American or Jewish American, the diaspora it's a diaspora. It's many facets. So do some work. Right. And understand what they have culturally.
An African American young person growing up in Pasadena is going to have dealt with a lot of different things than a young person growing up in Compton. Exactly.
But that's clearly...
There will be similarities, but vast differences.
But vast differences. My life in Pasadena is going to be different than my life in Compton by far. And you have to understand that. But it does not mean that the kid from Compton cannot aspire to great things and isn't aspiring to great things, just like the kid in Pasadena is aspiring to great things. It doesn't mean that the kid in Compton can't understand your philosophy and maybe even go into a psychoanalytic model of something, and the kid in Pasadena may not even benefit from a psychoanalytic model. So you have to be able and be willing to actually be varied and deal with the client from where they are.
Great. And what can people do to contribute positively to overall mental health of the community within the African American community?
So this one, I'm going to try to two-prong it real quick. I think we're already seeing that. So I'm on a lot of social media sites, and what I do is I follow a lot of young folk. When I say young folk, I'm saying...
And that's where they're at.
Right. I follow people 30 and younger. And they're on social media, and they're talking African American and Latino American kids and abroad throughout the diaspora are talking about depression. They're talking about bipolar. They're talking about mental health and mental illness, and there's no stigma. It's the older generation of African Americans, the 60s on up, who really have the stigma still associated with it. And, I see the 30-somethings and younger doing something about it. So I see it changing. I see a little change. So what we can do...
That's really hopeful.
Right. Yeah. What we can do is continue to provide the resources and the assistance to help change the narrative of what that stigma looks like. So because they're not afraid to talk about depression, they're not afraid to talk about suicide. Oftentimes, if I see one of the young people say something about, I was thinking suicide, or my friend is thinking about suicide, I'll post the suicide hotline number, and ultimately I'll get 30, 40 retweets just like that. Just like, of course, but clearly there are people out there who need this, and they're seeing it, whereas before they probably would not have passed on the information. I've seen young people on there complain about depressive symptoms. I said, well, maybe you should see a therapist. They don't know I'm a therapist. They just see some guy with his picture. They don't know who I am. They just know this. And I'm like, maybe have you thought about seeing a therapist? And gotten into some really unique dialogue with young folk, and they're not afraid. I don't have the money. I don't have this. They don't have that. So then it's like, now I'm forced as a clinician to try to find sliding scale fee services in their communities, and some of them may be in Boston or St. Louis or Miami, but I'm looking around, I'm on the net surfing and saying, well, here's a resource that maybe this can help you. So I think we need to be able to provide better resources and be able to help them, because the older generation, we're going to have a hard time having them come in. But the younger generation, they're seeking out the help. So let's don't turn them away. Let's make sure that we provide them with the assistance that they can get the help that they need. I think that's how I would say.
So it's to continue putting more out there for the young people.
Fostering them.
And then for the older generation to find ways to connect with them. Because that population, that age group, they confront a lot of issues where they could use assistance.
For certain, definitely.
So I don't want to
They're
give up
afraid,
on
though.
them.
No, I'm not giving up on them
No, I'm
either.
not suggesting that, but that we somehow find a way to make it more palatable for them.
I believe that we continue working with our older generation, and ultimately the way to tear down those walls are to address, go in and recognize the outcomes that we're facing because of those people who are 60, 70, and 80, they live during real segregation. So you got to address these harsh issues. They watched Malcolm X get killed, Hajj Malik Shabazz get killed. They watched Dr. King get killed. They watched Stokely Carmichael get killed. They watched these people get killed, and they're like, they are infrastructure afraid. They need the help. There's no question about it.
Let's face it, it's a lot to swallow to say, and I've seen this particularly with Muslims who we're already dealing with Islamophobia. And then if you're African American, then you've got you're dealing with the racism too.
Islamophobia, racism.
Then if somebody tells you have a mental health issue, then it's like, really? You want me to believe I've got all these things to deal with?
Yeah, right.
And, I'm not taking that on, right?
I don't need, I rebuke that. That's what you may hear. Yeah, I rebuke that. No, I'm not taking a mental health issue on. I think that's the thing about it is, let's define what mental health is. It's like, is it a cure? There's no cure, right? Let's get that on the table. But it's being able to provide the services, and I'll piggyback to the young lady that I spoke about. Finding her the right medicine for her ADHD versus her being diagnosed as bipolar and having the wrong medicine, it changed her life dramatically and drastically. So it's being able to go in and actually not cure it, but change life and have a better and a more dynamic life about you. So you're not afraid of mental health because that isn't not something else to pile on top of the mess that you already been told that you are. And no, it's like, people are going to rebuke that. I can see why, I did it. You know, you find a black male therapist, I'll go, right? I did that personally. But then after looking back on it, it's like, man, that's kind of crazy and not fair to me. Because at the end of the day, I benefited greatly from going to therapy. So I think as we knock down those walls and, you know, you and I are just in regular places where they don't even know that we're therapists, but we're able to add to the conversation, we're probably going to knock down walls more than we're going to build them up. Whether it's with the young folk or the older folk, we got to build up. We have to knock down walls and get them coming through the door. And I love it whether I'm with the older folk or the younger generation, and they ask about therapy or they ask a question and I'm able to answer it, and they're like, I really never thought about it like that. And then they start seeking out.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, great. I know that we're just scratching the surface here.
Definitely scratching the surface, very surface.
And I have so many other questions I want to ask you, but we kind of have to wrap up this episode. But I do want to ask you if there's anything else that we didn't talk about that you wanted to mention.
I would say, you know, I would like to see people look for the resources in their community. They would be surprised how many therapists, social workers, psychologists that are in their community who are trained in modalities to assist them, whether it's an African-centered psychology modality or whether it's even a Minutia-centered modality that could assist them in guiding them and actually finding a way into the therapeutic chair. They don't have to come see me, but try to go see someone to get their assistance that they need, because it'll just benefit them.
And so I would like to make an appeal to anyone watching. If you have resources that particularly are helpful to the African American community, please send them to our email, nefshealertherapy@gmail.com, and we will add them to our adjunctive website at www.nefshealertherapy.wordpress.com so that other people can access them as well.
And I'll throw out one little thing. If you're looking for a referral, you can go to www.absci.org, which is the Association of Black Psychologists.org. There's a referral site there in all 50 states where you can find an African American and African-centered psychologist in your state or even in your city. They can drill down and help you actually find someone through that one. So that may be something that you would like to.
And so when you say ABSI, it's ABPSY or
ABPSI.
Okay.
Like
so I want to make sure.
ABPSI.org.
And okay, so great. So now we're going to switch to some fun questions to wrap
ready.
this up.
I'm ready.
We like to ask all our interviewees some fun questions.
Let's go.
So who is your favorite hero if you have one, and why?
Wow. And I'm not saying this because it's Muslim America, but this is true. Muhammad Ali is actually my favorite hero. The irony of it is Muhammad Ali, when he was training for his first fight before he was Muhammad, he was Cassius Clay, in Miami, he actually trained across the street from where my grandmother lived.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So my grandmother called him Cassius Clay until her death. She never called him Muhammad Ali. She's like, Cassius, that nice guy. Like, his name's Muhammad Ali, Grandma. So Muhammad Ali. That's my hero.
And what is your favorite concept and why?
My favorite concept is a concept I came up with when I was going through my divorce. And that's positive thoughts will lead to positive results. So I constantly try to stay positive because I feel like when I'm in a negative place, undoubtedly something negative will come my way. So I try to remain positive, and it's actually panned out really well for me.
That's great. And what about your favorite word and why?
Favorite word? Oh, wow. You did ask this and I kind of slipped. Pontificate.
Pontificate. And why is that?
Because I like to talk. I pontificate a lot. so
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I think this has been very educational. People will it'll raise their awareness and hopefully even make them more comfortable in seeking out their own therapy.
I hope so.
For either themselves or a loved one.
And definitely, I pray that, that it does work out for them. If they ever have any questions, they could find me. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, just look me up and I'll go.
So what is your preferred method of contact?
If it's just like for basic questions, you can, friend me on Facebook and say you saw me on the viewed this and you wanted to speak to me, or on Twitter. My Twitter is at @J_Sams, so J_SAMS. And my Facebook is, you won't see my picture on either of them, I don't think. Yeah, because I block it out. But it'll say like, keep calm, call Jarvis. So that's what my picture is. So keep calm, call Jarvis. It's on Facebook. It's Jarvis Sams. So Jarvis Sams, all one word, and you should be able to find me there. And yeah, just, inbox me and I'll gladly answer a question. I have no problems with that. If you're looking to maybe come on for me to be a therapist, Heather will get my number to you offline, and they can call me, and I'll gladly figure it out. Can I add one last thing? And I apologize. I really want to add this. I think another thing that, and it slipped my mind earlier, African Americans are afraid of therapists and psychologists. And the irony of it is, when I started calling myself a life coach, they started coming in droves.
Interesting.
So I think we're more comfortable with the idea of someone helping us through life versus therapy. And there's a stigma with the word therapy. And it was the irony of it is a life coach. So I call myself that sometimes. It's just a life coach. It's just easier, and I think it makes me a little bit more accessible to my community. So that's the last point I wanted to make.
Great. That's good to know. So, okay, great. Well, this is going to conclude another episode of Muslims and Mental Health. Again, if you have any comments, questions, feedback, or concerns, which we always love to hear, you can reach us at nefshealertherapy@gmail.com. And if you want to get a hold of this guy, you can also send us an email and we'll send you his information. Also, please do join us on our adjunctive website at www.nefshealertherapy.wordpress.com for other great resources. And we look forward to seeing you back here soon. Thank you.
Hi, welcome to Adelante. This is Adelante Recovery, and my name is Yvette Kuglin, and I'm part of the staff.
Adelante Recovery Center has helped people in dual diagnosis for 5 years. We accept most PPO insurances and provide luxury accommodations and 24-hour support. To speak with an admissions counselor, call 1-888-242-4450.
A lot of time we don't even know what's wrong with us, and sometimes we need to get away to figure that out. So if you want to go for a little retreat out in Corona Del Mar, which is a confidential location, we're here to help. So we're only a phone call away. Thank you.